What's up everybody, I'm HoopsandHipHop, and really quick before we get started, I just needed to give a big thank you to Reggie Fils-Aimé, President of Nintendo of America. As you may have heard, he is going to be retiring in the next couple of months, and he has done so much for Nintendo over the past decade and a half, and he's just really a living legend, and us as Nintendo fans owe so much to him. So from the bottom of my heart and from the bottom of all of us who are fans of Nintendo and video games, thank you, Reggie. Enjoy your retirement. With that being said though, it's time to move on to today's Pokemon topic. Over the past year or so, we've seen a lot of things from the Pokemon franchise that were leaked, that were basically originally going to happen at some point in time, but were scrapped for one reason or another, and it really just makes you think about how much is going on behind the scenes at Game Freak, and how much they have got in the works that we actually never end up seeing upon the final release of any game. Whether it be a scrapped mechanic, a scrapped Pokemon, or even a scrapped character, there are a lot of things that don't get the honor of being in a final Pokemon game, and there's actually even some entire Pokemon games in general that just didn't get to see the light of day before their ideas were ultimately canned. Today we are going to be talking about 5 amazing Pokemon games that never actually happened, and the story behind each one of these games is very unique and very different. Some of them basically were just talked about as a possibility by developers themselves, and some of them actually went into development and were actually going to happen at one point in time. Either way, all of these had a legitimate shot of being real, but for one reason or another didn't get the honor of becoming an actual thing, and I think at the very least they deserve some spotlight, so we are going to tell their story in this video. That's pretty much all I have to say on the introduction side of things though, so without any further ado, let's just go ahead and dive right in. The first game on this list, while it isn't technically impossible for it to happen at this point, it is very, very unlikely. However, it is one that I personally am dying to see happen, even if it is a bit of a pipe dream, and that would be Pokémon Warriors. That's right, you have probably heard of Dynasty Warriors or Fire Emblem Warriors or Hyrule Warriors recently, as all of those games have been getting the spotlight on Nintendo systems recently, but there was actually mention of an interest in making a Pokémon Warriors game at one point in time that actually had the support of Game Freak. Shortly after the release of the first Nintendo Dynasty Warriors crossover game, Hyrule Warriors, the developers of the game, Koei Tecmo, sat down for an interview which basically consisted of them talking about what games they would like to make in the future and what Nintendo franchises they would like to use in future crossovers as well. During the interview, Koei Tecmo Executive Vice President Hisashi Koinuma actually said that he is interested in making a Pokemon Warriors game, and the general producer of the Pokemon series, Junichi Masuda, was actually favorably supportive of this idea, saying that he would be supportive of it as long as it wasn't too violent. Now, as I said earlier, this interview was conducted and these statements were made shortly after the release of the initial Hyrule Warriors game, and it actually took another 2.5 years after these statements before we would see the next Nintendo Warriors game, which ended up being Fire Emblem Warriors in 2017. So given that amount of time, and given the fact that the next game in the franchise obviously proved not to be Pokemon, it's frankly very unlikely that we're ever going to see this. However, with that being said, both the Hyrule Warriors and the Fire Emblem Warriors games have done well, so it's possible that they will continue this franchise with other crossovers in the future. And the fact that Pokemon was initially brought up as a possible franchise that would work, and it has the support of Game Freak, I don't think it's 100% out of the question, even though it's very unlikely. The fact that this was even brought up as a legitimate possibility by the developers who make the games themselves, though, is the reason why I'm talking about it in this video, because for the most part, this kind of idea seems like something that fans would come up with and not actual game developers. So because it came from the mouth of the people that actually make the game in the first place, I definitely thought it was at least worth a mention. The next one we're going to be talking about is the idea of Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee with photorealistic graphics, and yes, this is something that was actually somewhat in development before we got the final product that we see today. The Pokemon community was very much split on the graphical style of these games, with many people saying that it was way too childish and appealed way more to the casual audience as opposed to the hardcore fans that have been with the franchise since the beginning. So, as you can probably imagine, it didn't really help this argument when it was discovered that the developers of Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee over at Game Freak actually played around with the idea of using photorealistic graphics for the game. In an interview with IGN, Game Freak artist Kensaku Nabana stated the following when talking about the development of the game. Usually, when you have much more power with the Switch and taking it into HD, I think the natural tendency is to go for a more photorealistic approach. In the earliest days of development, we actually explored that direction quite a bit, but we got the direction from Masuda, just like he just mentioned a moment ago, to go for this more kind and soothing and inviting experience with the visuals. So, based on the context of this interview, it doesn't really seem like this was something that was just talked about like the Pokemon Warriors game that we mentioned earlier. It seems like they actually played around with this graphically and started actually developing the game in this photorealistic style before the director of the project, Junichi Masuda, instructed them that they needed to go for something that was a little more kind and inviting, as Nabana put it. Now, even though I personally loved Let's Go, and I think the graphical style is honestly perfect for the Pokemon franchise, I can't help but absolutely drool at the prospect of a photorealistic Let's Go experience. The power of the Nintendo Switch offers so much potential to the Pokemon franchise, and I think it's only natural to want to see an amazingly graphically realistic Pokemon experience such as this, because many of us have kind of been imagining what this kind of game would be like since we were little kids. And once again, even though I think the Let's Go games are great the way they are, I can't help but feel like the opinion of the games in the general community would have been much more favorable had they gone for this graphical realistic style. However, with that being said, I don't think we need to think about what could have been too much, because I personally feel like it's pretty likely, especially based on this statement, that we are going to get a more realistic approach with the Generation 8 Pokemon games that are said to be directed towards the hardcore Pokemon players, so I think we're just gonna have to wait a couple more months and then we will finally have the games that we've all wanted for a very long time. Now, in the middle of the list is actually the only game on this list that wasn't confirmed or mentioned to have possibly been in development at some point in time, and that would be the infamous, and I mean infamous, Pokémon Z. Now, we all know about Pokemon Z by now, so I will keep this brief, but I couldn't really not bring it up when talking about this sort of thing, because it just seemed like beyond obvious that we were going to get a game that featured more of Kalos and that featured Zygarde as the box art Pokemon. Everything from Zygarde itself that received a multitude of new forms in Pokemon Sun and Moon, not in X and Y, the generation it debuted in, and from the multitude of unfinished things that featured in X and Y itself, like the Koroway train station, like the multiple doors of the power plant, like Eternal Flower Floette that was built into the game that we never even saw make it into an official release. It just doesn't make any sense that they would have this many things within the game that look so seemingly unfinished if they didn't have plans for some kind of successor game after the release of X and Y. It would be great to know for certain from the developers themselves if they ever had plans for this type of game, but given that it looks very likely, this is absolutely the prototypical game that never was for the Pokemon franchise, because I don't know about you guys, but I loved X and Y, I loved Kalos, I loved Gen 6, and it seems like there was so much potential to grow there that wasn't realized, and it seems like we kind of just moved on to Gen 7 before Gen 6 had its opportunity to really shine, and it's definitely one of the more disappointing moments in Pokemon's history over the past few years. Next up on the list, we have a game that I have mentioned briefly in the past, but I haven't really ever seen anyone else talk about it, and that would be the fate of the game that eventually became Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. Even though Pokémon XD is a sequel to the critically acclaimed Pokémon Colosseum, it seems like it originally wasn't going to be that at all, because back before the release of Pokémon XD, our main man and Nintendo legend, Reggie Fils-Aimé, actually stated that Pokémon XD wasn't going to be a sequel to Colosseum, but rather a brand new game that had a similar style to Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. Now, obviously with a brief statement like this, it's anyone's guess as to what this game was originally going to be, but I also think it's safe to say that this was going to be very different than the Pokémon XD we got originally, because it was clearly stated by Reggie, according to Bulbapedia anyway, that this would not be a sequel to Colosseum, even though it is, and that it would have a playstyle similar to Ruby and Sapphire and would be a whole new game. And these two comments in tandem, the fact that it was said that it wouldn't be a sequel to Colosseum, but would have a similar playstyle to Ruby and Sapphire, makes me believe that this was actually going to be closer to a main series Pokemon game on a home console than even Colosseum or XD. Because up to this point, or rather up to the point prior to Let's Go, Colosseum and XD were the closest things we had to a main series traditional Pokemon game on a home console. So the fact that he specifically cited main series games when talking about what this game would be like tells me that they were actually going to do a main series Pokemon game, or at least a closely related spin-off, on the Nintendo GameCube before, for some reason, they decided to go the XD route instead. This statement is really the only thing we have to go off of though, and given that it's very brief and it's been like 10 to 15 years since XD came out anyway, it's most likely that we are never going to hear anything about this again. But just the simple idea that XD could have been very different to what we saw in the final release, and could have possibly even been closer to a main series type of game than even the Colosseum series was already, is at the very least a very interesting what could have been type of idea, and is also at the very least worth some insightful discussion. And last but not least is a game that has definitely been talked about before, but it also had to be mentioned here in this video for the simple fact that it is the closest one out of these 5 games that ever came to actually happening, and in fact actually had a legitimate playable build of the game itself that featured in actual trade shows and demos, and that would of course be the original Pokémon Gold and Silver. The original idea for Pokémon Gold and Silver was very different to what we saw in the final release, so much so in fact that it can practically be considered its own separate game. Everything from the map, to the towns, to the Pokemon themselves, to the characters we saw, to the mechanics that were going to be introduced, to the story of the game itself, was significantly different to what we saw in the final product, and this was all revealed, of course, in a gigantic leak of the 1997 Gold and Silver beta demo that featured in Nintendo Space World 1997 that ultimately leaked on the internet from an anonymous source in the middle of last year. Just to give you an idea for those that don't know, originally the Johto region was meant to encompass the entirety of Japan instead of just the Kansai region that it encapsulated in the final version of the game. On top of that, we also saw early versions of what would eventually become Canalave City and Snowpoint City in the Sinnoh region, and amongst all of this as well, they still managed to incorporate the Kanto region as well, even though it was very much watered down compared to what we saw in the final game. There were also a number of Pokemon that were planned to feature in this game that did not make the final cut and haven't been seen in any Pokemon games since, but there were also some ones that we ended up seeing later on, like Mime Jr. for instance, that was originally planned as early as Generation 2. There was even evidence within the data of the demo that suggested characters such as Giovanni were planned to make an appearance, and in the case of Giovanni specifically, this would have had major implications on the story of the game, which is why I'm saying this version of Gold and Silver is practically an entire different game to the final version of Gold and Silver that we all know. Now, Gold and Silver as well as their remakes are my favorite Pokemon games of all time, so it's extremely difficult for me to say this, but I am very tempted to say that I would almost rather have this version of Gold and Silver as opposed to the one that we actually got, because everything from the increased map size to all of the Pokemon that we didn't see to the potential of the different story just really makes it seem like this would have been an amazing experience. And given the fact that they put so much into the game because they thought it was going to be the last Pokemon game, really makes me think that it was going to be a special experience, the likes which we would have never seen again, and it really makes me want to play it, and I really wish it actually would have happened. And there we have it, everybody. Those were 5 amazing Pokemon games that never actually happened. When you have a franchise that is as big as the Pokemon franchise is, naturally you're going to have some of these situations pop up where an idea is presented but just doesn't make it into a final product. However, even though this sometimes does happen, it doesn't mean that it's not a shame, because obviously each and every one of these ideas would have been fantastic. If you guys enjoyed the video though, be sure to give it a like and let me know down in the comments below which one of these games you would most like to be real and you would most like to play. If you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe for more Pokemon content every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and if you're on Spotify, go ahead and give me a follow there as well, because it supports the channel here and is always appreciated. With all of that being said though, I will be back with another video on Tuesday, so be sure to hit that notification bell so you can be notified when it goes live. And with all of that being said, I hope you guys have a great weekend. I love you guys, and I will smell you guys later.